When I say Bushiroad, what's the first thing that comes to mind for you guys? No doubt for some people, it'll probably be the involvement in Love Live, especially the mobile game that they had, or perhaps Bang Dream, D4DJ, maybe even Starlight Review, or maybe even the fact that they sponsored many of the HoloLive events as well. And it wouldn't be surprising, if anything. After all, that is what tends to be their more successful works out there. But if, like me, you're old, unfortunately, then you might remember them more for their card games, if anything. With games such as Cardfight Vanguard, maybe even White Shorts, which is still ongoing to this day, or perhaps they're one of the people who came across it with the new HoloLive card game that they had made. This is still an area where they still make quite a fair bit of money as well. Hi, hello, I'm a random game dev in Japan, not like that matters as much for this video, but what does matter is that I am someone who does enjoy my, as the people in the West like to put it, my cardboard crack as well. In fact, I'm someone who, as you can see over here, just hit Mythic and MTGA last month as well. And not only that, but I did actually play a lot of Bushiroad's card games back in the past. Here is one of my White Schwartz decks, as you can see. Bunch of very shiny cards in it. Bunch of cards with fake Seiyu signatures on it as well. This is an entire deck for Mami from Madoka. And not only are the cards in it all from Madoka, but the sleeve on the back as well is basically just Mami giving you money to go and gamble on pachinko, because frankly, if you're the kind of person who's going to be playing White Schwartz, you probably are playing a game that's as good as playing pachinko, to be honest. Or how about another modern deck for Nanoha as well? Here are cards from a completely different card game that they made that is currently dead, but I still have my deck perfectly in its original condition in case people actually want to play a dead card game for some reason. But yeah, I'm someone who has played a lot of their card games in the past, including Vanguard as well. So believe me when I say that I have played and have a lot of experience with all of the card games that Bushiroad has made across the years. And one thing that I can say is that, aside from the card games that people know nowadays, they actually do have a lot of other very dead card games under their belt as well. In fact, I would say that the number of card games they have produced, probably more than 2/3 of them at this point are actually dead. Now, of course, I get what some of you, especially those of you who are really into the card game scene, might say, right? And I totally agree with you. Bandai Namco, Konami, or even WotC, the creators of Magic the Gathering, all of them do have quite a few dead card games under their belt. Like, Konami has tried their hand at making a bunch of IP-related ones. Bandai Namco has made a few in the past, some of which they have resurrected, and when it comes to WotC as well, they have made a lot of tie-up games that also failed in the past. Yet, in spite of that, in spite of the fact that all of these companies did have the same types of failings in the past, in this day and age, in the year 2025, where card games still have been trending upwards as a market in terms of its growth over the years, and with Bushiroad's card games actually being fairly high up there in terms of the total number of games that they have in the top 15, for example. And yet, in spite of this, if you compare their titles to games created by other companies of the same caliber, you will notice that there just seems to be a massive lack of organic content. And by this, I mean that when you were to look at something like, for example, a cursory glance of the top 5 games, right? You have One Piece, you have White Schwartz, you have Yu-Gi-Oh!, and you have Magic within Japan. A cursory glance at the other titles tend to show up a lot more people talking about the game, about the new sets, about what they're excited for, there being gameplay, how you can build decks, and a lot of that. But when it comes to White Schwartz, you tend to see a lot less of that, and not only that, but you tend to see more, especially in the English community, of people just talking about it like it's an investment instead of as a game. And even when you look at the sales of the game itself, the sales tend to fluctuate a lot more than most other titles. Like, when it comes to Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh!, yeah, Magic, it kind of is like falling a little bit in sales in Japan, but you do tend to see that even if there is a increase or decline, it tends to be fairly stable. It isn't as extreme as what White Schwartz has gone through over the last few years. And the reason I feel that a lot of this is happening is simply because of the fact that Bushiroad has a very big issue with trying to retain players for its game, or getting people to even play the game in spite of the fact that it does very well in sales. Because as someone who used to go for White Schwartz tournaments in the past, I always found it really strange how, in spite of the fact that the game was always showing constantly increasing sales numbers, that the number of tournament attendees was actually falling with each year. So you tended to see that the number of people who were interested in actually playing the game, both in official tournaments and shop tournaments, was going on the decline. But the sales was just constantly going up, as if people were mostly just collecting the cards instead of playing the game. Simply due to the fact that while Bushiroad is very good at making people want to purchase the cards for collection, they just kind of really suck at designing card games or balancing them overall. Which in a weird way isn't completely a bad thing, because of the fact that while they aren't the best at balancing the games, they do seem to be firmly aware of that, and they try to design their games in a way that this doesn't become as big of a problem. And so I feel like it is both their biggest strength as well as their biggest weakness, as they are able to understand this weakness and then design their games in a way that can compensate for it as well. And when you couple this with their ability to actually get other IPs to cooperate with them in the designing of cards for their card game, I would say that they do have a lot of drawing power with their card games, in fact. And with this video, we're going to look a lot more in depth into that, as we look into why many of their games in the past have failed along the way, why some of their games are still surviving till this day, and why some of their games have been necroed back to life, or may even be said to be imitations of someone else's game, some might say. Yes, it was kind of difficult trying to record all of that with me rhyming in a single take. I guess you could call me a rap god, you can call me creepy D's nuts. I don't know if the payoff was even worth it for that stupid joke, but this is the era where they had just started out in the card game scene, where, like many of the other companies out there, they were still struggling to figure out what works and what doesn't, and so there were many failures along the way. That said, I'm not gonna overly criticize those games as a result, because at this time, to say that Bushiroad should know better is a little bit difficult, since this was when most companies wouldn't have known as well, and Bushiroad, having just started out in the scene, had no track record of other games from which they could learn from the mistakes of. And some of the things that they did experiment with trying to do did seem interesting during this period, although many of the games did end up failing in the end. And so we'll be starting with what might actually be the first ever recorded card game that Bushiroad ever made, which is a card game called Jewelpets. Yes, this is the exact same Jewelpets that Sunreal and Sega Toys actually collabed to try and push as a new line or series of theirs, which got an animation in 2009, I believe. And Bushiroad basically got in on the action by trying to help them develop a card game to sell alongside it back in 2009. The only thing I find kind of funny with the title for this game is the fact that it actually doesn't have any form of subtitling whatsoever. It's just called Jewelpets, the exact same thing as the actual IP itself, rather than having any text below to signify that this is a different thing card game for the series itself. When it comes to this specific title, what we do know from articles back during the era is that Bushiroad designed this card game with the main target audience being little girls, as in actual, probably before teenage levels of little girls instead. And as a result, because that was their key target audience, this is what they had to say about their choice and why they designed the game in the way they did. They made the backgrounds of the cards really shiny because they said that it was a lot like jewels, and women love jewels, according to them. They love shiny things. Oh, look at the shine on that. That's so good. Hey, wait a minute! I feel like it's not just me. I feel like the Yu-Gi-Oh! As well as the MTG community would have a lot of very strong things to say about saying that shiny cards are just a woman thing. Alright, I like when my cardboard crack waifus are shiny as well. That's a little rude to say that only women like it like that. The text was made to be intentionally minimal and big, so that even for little kids, it'll be very easy to understand what's written on the cards. Alright, so we have the obligatory reading the card explains the card, and it would seem that even after 20 years, card game players still have not figured out how to read card effects yet. And it was designed to just be a very simple game, using just numbers and rock, paper, scissors. Perhaps Bushiroad just knew from the very start what pro gamers truly wanted from their game. I mean, if you think about it, many years later, Hearthstone would then go on to create a card called Pro Gamer, which forced you to play rock, paper, scissors with your friends, so clearly Bushiroad was just very ahead of their time. Unfortunately, this game didn't seem to do really well because of the fact that actually trying to find cards for it was super difficult, to be honest. Even when I looked through the entire resale market for everything Jewelpets, there was no way to find an actual trial deck or any of the boosters from the card game back in the day. Hell, it's even easier for me to get a poster that was being used to advertise the game than it is for me to get my hands on actual cards for the game. But thankfully, I did manage to get my hands on 2 copies of the cards, and so this is what the cards for the game look like. And as you can see, it pretty much is exactly as they had described it. As you can see, the shine is still fairly obvious, very shiny, a lot like many of the rare cards that you would see in a modern card game. So I don't know what they were on about when they said that only women would like this, when they are basically peddling this to grown men with their cardboard crack as well nowadays. Text is very simplified. The cards in this game have no effects. It's literally just the name of the jewel that the pet is based off and the name of the pet. Hence the name of the IP. Really brilliant if you think about it. And then down here you have whether it's rock, paper or scissors. There's the number there and this is the element type. So it really is designed in a way where everything is very obvious on the card itself, and it's very easy for people to see what all of the key components of the card are. Thankfully, the person who uploaded that actual image also did upload a bunch of the things for the game, such as the entire card list for all of the cards within the trial deck, as well as the game board, as well as the tutorial for the game. So we're going to look at that, and we're going to do the best we can to try and look, analyze, and play the game while trying to figure out what went wrong with it. So we'll be using our best friend to try and solve this issue. And by best friend, I don't mean an actual person, since I don't really have that many friends, but we'll be using our best friend, Adobe Photoshop. Right, so what you see here is the card list for the first booster in the game. The booster has 44 cards, which basically means that this game, which is basically just rock, paper, scissors, bingo, had more cards in its first booster than the very first Yu-Gi-Oh one. So you can already tell that we're going to be in for a very in-depth game of bingo, rock, paper, scissors, I guess. As you can see, the main things that we pointed out for every one of the cards before are also here. You have the numbers in the top, the gem in the right along with the color of the cards. Basically, the way this game works, as you can see on the cards, you have the rocks, you have the papers, you have the scissors. I do apologize if the image is a little low res, since this is from a fairly old as well as scuffed image that someone took back in the day. But as you can see, aside from the rock, paper, scissors, there is the number on the top left as well as the color of the card. The colors of the card will be actually important for the win condition of the game, and the numbers at the top of the card are basically meant to be used in the event of a tiebreaker. So the way this works is that if you and the opponent somehow actually ties, then the card with a higher number on the top left is the one that will actually win instead. In case you're wondering, no, the actual color of the card doesn't actually make a difference to like some kind of elemental thing that gives you a combo or anything, nor does the fact that the cards with numbers 1 and 2 in them actually have a item instead of the Jewelpet, like the number 3 and 4 cards. All of that actually doesn't really mean anything at all. All it just means, I guess in a way, is that the items are weaker than the pets. But this isn't an equipment or a spell card of some sort like in Yu-Gi-Oh or something that you can equip to the creature. Instead, it really is just a card with the exact same purpose with a different image on it. And to explain how the color itself actually matters to the game, we'll actually need to open the game itself. And here is the actual game board. As you can see, there are 4 main points to the board aside from the play area. This area on the right over here, this is your play area. You basically have the home. This is where you put your deck. This is where you put the card that is in play. And this is where you put all of the cards that basically do not win a round. And so the way you play the game is very simple. You put 20 cards in your deck face down in the first home area here. You and your opponent would then take the top card of the deck, flip it over and put it in the stage area over here. Then the winner will basically get to put their card in here. You get to pick where to put it depending on whether it's a rock, paper or scissors. So scissors, you put it in the middle, rock, you put it at the top, paper, you put it at the bottom. And if you lost, you will put your card in the album instead. The goal of the game essentially to try and get a card of each color in a row in any direction with all 3 colors. So you maybe want a red, for example, rock, a green rock, and a blue rock. Or maybe you want a red rock, a green scissors, and a blue paper, whichever way you want to do it. Quite literally just a game of bingo that you have here, nothing complicated to it at all. And the first person to basically complete the bingo wins the game. Very basic, almost no form of actual thought or strategy required in the game, except if you are very perceptive, you may have noticed one thing from before, and that is that within the card list, you have a type of card that was black colored instead. And the thing with the black colored card is that it's not actually required for the win condition. Instead, the black cards are essentially what you could call a jammer card, where if you win a round while you have the black card, you get to select one of the cards that your opponent has within the stage area here, and you get to forcibly put it into the album instead. Basically, whatever plan they may have had, you get to wreck it if you are actually able to do that. So in that sense, you do have a little bit of a way that you could, I guess, play around how your opponent is doing so far. But the issue with the way that the black card works is that because you still need to win the round, and because of the fact that you don't get to select the order in which you play out the cards, if you actually get, like for example, say you play one of the black cards in your deck and it's the first card that comes out and you actually win, the opponent then has nothing here for you to toss. So strategically, it isn't very meaningful, unless one thing that is very, very important when you talk about all of this type of card games and that people who play a lot of card or deck building games would ask is, well then, how can I build the deck? What is the number of cards I can put in? How many of each card type can I put in for that matter? The only restriction that is actually put on the game is that you need to basically have 5 copies of each of the numbers in the deck. So you need to have 5 number 1s, 5 number 2s, 5 number 3s, and 5 number 4s. But the game doesn't actually restrict you in terms of the colors that you can play. Now, this might then, some of you, maybe the red flags in your head are already going off, and if like me, you are an asshole when you play card games, then yes, you are right. This means that you could theoretically, because of the type of cards that exist in this game, just play 5, 5, 5, and 5. And basically what you can do is you can prevent other people from completely winning that game and getting both of you stuck in a perpetual draw. And to me, I find this very interesting because this game actually is very lacking in the amount of thought that is actually put into the rules of the game. So the game basically just ends when you run out of cards in the deck, but this isn't actually explained in the rules area over here at all. And yeah, I feel like this is the main issue with this game overall. Basically, the rules of this game are not well designed, they're not detailed enough, not comprehensive enough to be able to ensure that the game comes to a logical conclusion with a winner or a loser. Because all it basically states in the rules is that if you run out of cards in your deck, the game ends, but it doesn't say what happens in that case. How do you decide a winner? It doesn't set any rules on the way you can structure a deck either. It sort of assumes that you somehow come to the logical conclusion yourself that you want to have the best balance of all 3 colors in order to have a deck that can actually win the game. And yeah, at the same time, they also simultaneously give you the side objective of playing the black cards in your deck, which arguably doesn't really do anything in this game other than make the experience worse for the two of you. Because realistically, playing that card isn't a good thing in any way, shape, or form for if you actually wanted to win the game. Because every time you win with that, you're just basically setting your opponent back, but not actually progressing your own board. Because if you win, you also put the card in the album instead of actually tossing it into the field. So you don't actually get to progress. I get it, you know, this game was made for little girls. They probably didn't think enough about the time because of the fact that they probably didn't think that anyone was ever gonna actually play the game. And to be fair, I don't think anyone actually did. The only people I know who actually have these cards seem to be Jewelpet fans and collectors who are probably in their like 30s or 40s at this point. So not even the right target audience for the cards to begin with. But yeah, with this card game overall, it just felt like there was just a little bit of a mismatch in target audiences, in the sense that the target audience of people who would actually spend on the card game were very different from the target audience of the medium, and as a result, it just never really caught on. And the simplicity of the game, because they thought that was what would appeal best to their target audience, it feels like it kind of drove away the people that would have actually wanted to play a card game instead. That said, we'll be moving on to the next card game now. This one actually had a much more in-depth system and is a little more complex, though it made a lot more sense since this game was targeting a much older audience in general. Fujoshis and Wotakus. So we're gonna be looking more into the game itself, but we're not gonna do that here because that will be boring and might make this video a little too draggy if I just do everything in here. So we'll be going somewhere else to spice up the mood a little. Well, hello there. So glad you could join us on this wonderful evening. As you can see, we are indeed in a hotel. A cheap one perhaps, but still a fantastically hotelish hotel. And that's because it's really fitting about the game we're going to be talking about next. For you see, we're going to be talking about a game which is based on the themes of love and mad. Okay, yeah, this is getting a little weird. Look, the next game we're going to be talking about is a game that is called Alice Cross. So, Alice Cross is a game that Bushiroad made in 2009 after the Jewelpets game. So this game actually came out before many of the other anime IP card battle TCGs that they made, including Wise Shorts and Victory Spark, both of which came out in 2010. Funnily enough, it would seem that prior to making all of the different card games that they have made till now, especially most of those targeting the more male-ish side of the otaku sphere, they used to make games that targeted the otaku as well as the Fujo community just a little bit more. And in a way, it is kind of interesting since they went from targeting little girls to targeting the slightly older female anime fan base to then going on to targeting the more male fan base of like anime in general. So to me, it's kind of interesting to see that strange progression, especially since nowadays they kind of seem to have gone back a little with White Shorts Blau, but that's besides the point. One thing that I do find kind of interesting with this game is the fact that it actually comes in a fairly high-ish quality, perhaps, like little deck box here. And as you can see, it is actually fairly well decorated for this series. I think this one is from Vitamin X. So you have the characters on it, on the back, on the front, on the side, the IP's name and all of that. And you have a little explanation here on what the game's base themes are. Frankly, this feels like somebody took the concept of the game, like what you would put in your prologue of your GDD, and just plastered it over here to tell you what this game is meant to be about. And I find this bit here to be a little funny, since it actually does explain that the whole goal of this game is to get the person who is basically the partner in the game to fall in love with your main character first. So in case you're wondering, the whole concept of this game is basically you are competing with the other player to see who can get their main character loved by the partner character the fastest. No, you're not both competing over the same guy or same like whoever, as if this is some kind of like shoujo anime race to be the first person to get with the guy. It's not a thing where you're trying to NTR the other person as well. Instead, this is a game where you're basically participating in competitive speed running of getting into a relationship, I guess. I feel like it's a very weird thing to be competing over in the first place, but you know, I feel like if you're going to create a game that is for the Fujo and Wotaku community, you didn't really have to like gloss or skip over the whole like conflict directly, like, my dude is gonna punch your girlfriend in the face or something like that. I feel like with how aggressive the Fujo community can be, to be honest, at times, especially when you see how bad the goods that gets called for them at Comic Cat. I feel like they are already very, very well versed with the idea of fighting for their lives for the sake of their husbandos. But anyway, the interesting thing I find with this deck, this trial deck that they gave, is the fact that when you open it, as you can see, you have the cards in it, right? You have the cards, you have the instruction manual and all of this. And then for half the box, you just have this piece of cardboard here that literally does nothing. Like this just packs up the board. And it literally just has the instructions on the back, but aside from that, it just does nothing at all. Now, I get why they put that in, like after thinking about it a little more, but it's a little bit of a weird reason, because what they did was they basically made an abridged version of the official game that uses 20 cards specifically for if you wanted to play with someone else who only also has a trial deck. So you both could play a trial version of the game that it has simplified rules, and only uses 20 cards instead of the full 40. Now, why they would go through the entire effort of creating a completely separate game mode that uses 20 cards? If you really want to sell people on the game that you have created, you typically do want people to play, you know, the game. I feel like people who picked up just the starter pack and decided to like try out the game, they may very well have just chosen not to play the game, even potentially because of the fact that the rules are just so different from the actual full game instead. Anyway, here are the cards. As you can see, it's not really my thing, but this is the female main character for this set, because Vitamin X, I think, is like a Bishonen game instead. So instead of having just guys going at it with each other, you do have a female main character who the male characters would all fawn over instead. Comparing this to Vice Shorts even, this actually feels like a fairly complex game. And I feel like, if anything, this might actually turn off some of the people who would actually want to play the game, because like, I look at the game board itself and it just looks something like this instead. Like mate, am I going on a game show? Am I going on a treasure hunt? There's so many things going on this board that like, I don't even know where I'm supposed to begin just looking at this. Like, when I first opened the thing and I saw this board, I actually felt turned off from trying to figure out how to play the game, because it seems like too much going on in terms of just the rules required to learn the game itself. You think about all card games, right? Like something like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example. Your board didn't really have this much space. You had just 5 areas to play your monsters. 5 areas for spells and traps. Maybe a field, a graveyard, your deck, and that was about it. I mean, yeah, it has gotten more complicated since then with the extra deck and all of that. But back in the day, it was still fairly simple. Unlike like this, which I feel like would turn off a more casual audience, if anything. And it's not just the board itself. Look at the rules paper. Like, oh, and it's not just 1 page, by the way, it's 2 pages long. You need to figure all of this out in order to be able to even play the game in the first place. And thinking about it, not only do you have to figure all of this out, you have to figure it out and then realize that you need to figure out a completely different, or I guess a somewhat different rule set to be able to play the actual game as compared to the game that they gave you together with this trial deck in the first place. So let's play the game. I did get here with me a completely separate second deck for a series that I do not know, but this one seems to be BL instead. So for the sake of making this feel even more like a BL Fujo thing, I'm gonna stand behind the camera for this part, so you can see my hands as if I'm coming from behind and just like teaching you how to play the game for the people who are into that, I guess. Also, one thing I realized here that's kind of funny is the fact that everything here is in English, right? In terms of the English text are words in English, except specifically the word Yamafuda over here, which basically means your deck. Frankly, I don't know why the simplest word to have in English they chose to have like this, but it's a choice. Anyway, so the way this game works, once again, you would put aside the cards that don't matter, and you would take the characters with a 0% up here. You would pick 2 of them. So I guess we'll go with her, and that's a did. We'll go with like the hentai glasses over here, I guess. You pick them both, put them in the main character and partner slot, then you would shuffle the rest of your deck. Put the deck in the Yamafuda area, and then you would draw 5 cards. So the way this game works is that every card has a cost, which is the percentage up here instead. As you can see, some of it is 0. You can only play cards at whatever point on the love point bar you are at right now. So at the start of the game, everybody starts at 0. So unfortunately, I don't really have a good marker to use for this because they don't actually give us a marker. So we'll just use 100 yen, I guess. So you start here, and the game basically goes through 3 phases every single round. So you would play your phase, and then your opponent would play their 3 phases, and you just go in this order until one of you wins the game. So the first phase is called the morning phase, which is basically just the draw phase for the turn. If you play the card game, basically the only thing you do in this phase is just draw a card. Unfortunately, since we are the first player to go in this imaginary game where I'm just playing with the wall, I guess, we won't draw a card. Instead, we'll just go on to the next phase, which is called the afternoon. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, since with the afternoon, there are 3 different things that you can do, each with their own separate limit, it seems. So you can play 1 support card, you can play 2 event cards, and you can level up once. So basically, leveling up would involve taking a card with the same name as the card on the field and basically putting it over that card. Unfortunately, we don't have any of that right now. Instead, we have a bunch of the same guys. So all we can really do is play events and characters, which are basically supports. So the thing that they don't really mention is that basically every character in your deck that is not the main or the partner are basically supports. So the way this would work is that we have a 0%. You can play this in the support area. We can level up once as well. Also, another thing we need to take note of is that even though it says you can do thing 1, 2, and 3, you have to do things 1, 2, and 3 in order. So we have to play the support card first. This one unfortunately does nothing at all, but we'll put him there for now. And then number 2, you can only then after that play a event card, and only after you're down to event card can you level up a character. So we'll play an event card, I suppose. For example, we can play this event, which allows us to discard 1 character with B6 in their trait, and if we do so, this is the discard pile. We gain 10 LP, so we move this up to here. Then we can play this different event, which has an F over here. This is not asking us to pay respect to the game because probably no one ever respected the game. But what it means is that it's a forever card, as stated by this bigger F here, which is also not telling us to actually give this game any respect. So if we play this and our RP is less than 60, then at the end of the next phase, if he's on the field, we can move this up by 1, which will basically happen because since we can't level up, this is our entire phase, which is the night. So in the night, you also have multiple things you can do. This time the order isn't really specified. So what you can do is you can choose to discard up to 2 cards from your hand. Then we can discard this card, and we can then increase this by 5% for each card that we discard. And with this, our turn is done, and we will then let our opponent take their turn. Then on our turn, we will draw 2 cards basically. And we basically just repeat the cycle for the entire game. Unfortunately, it would seem that I played out my cards in the worst possible way possible, so all we have in our hand now is this. So the way this would then go is that by the end of the turn, yeah, we have nothing to do in the afternoon phase at all. Maybe we could play this event, but I don't have the cards to pay the cost, so we go to the end turn, this goes up by 5, and then like you basically just repeat the cycle every single turn. It would seem I'm really bad at shuffling the deck because I've basically kind of messed up all of this, but the goal of the game will basically be to just play and manage your hand and discard cards until you get this up to 95. And then in order to end the game, you basically need to have 2 characters with the card that has the word N over here on it. So if we get both of them on the field, let's say we play him last instead. So we are here now and we level him up. And we manage to pay the cost to level him up. Because he has an N effect, she has the N, and his effect increases this by 10%, we get to 100%. We maximize their love, and basically the game ends there and you win the game. Hey, did you miss me? Okay, maybe some of you may not miss me as much anymore, especially after the whole weird hotel scene which may have weirded some of you guys out. But overall, let's talk about the game itself. I do feel like with this game, we obviously have something that is a lot more complex than the previous game that we talked about. And it is interesting to me to see how this game was actually designed in a way. It feels a lot less like the card games that came before it, like Magic and Yu-Gi-Oh! In the sense that you had a lot less ability to interact with your opponents all the time, right? With Yu-Gi-Oh! You had trap cards, you had spell cards, which you didn't, I don't think had hand traps at the time yet, but you did have cards that allowed you to play and react on your opponent's turn, and Magic is just full of cards like that. But with this game, it reminds me a little more of something like Shadowverse or Hearthstone, where you play out your turn, and then your opponent plays out their turn, and then they can react to your actions on their turn if they have the right cards in hand. And the game pretty much ensures that your individual turns remain sacred in the sense that you have full control and are able to play all of your actions out at once. Personally, with that, I feel like it works in its own way. The whole idea of whether or not the player should have full agency during their turn and for reaction or interaction to be fully limited here is something that's a little debatable, since both styles of game actually work, and I feel like they do appeal to different types of people as well. Where this game fails, however, in my opinion, is the inability of the designers to design it in a way that would make it easy for people to want to pick up the game, if anything. In the sense that the rules tend to be a little bit full of jargon that isn't really necessary, that it feels like it will make it more confusing to people trying to pick up the game. And there's a lot of things I feel that could have been compartmentalized better to make it a little easier for people to pick up. You want a game that is simple to understand and pick up, but that has a lot of depth and complexity in terms of the things that you can then do with the deck once you have actually picked up the game, in terms of how you can structure what cards you put on, what cards you decide to play, and how and when to play them. Typically, card games are known as games that are mechanically simple, but systems-wise highly complex. And by mechanics and systems, just to ensure that we're on the same page, because different people use different terms, and sometimes the understanding or the interpretation of the terms can be slightly different. When I say systems and mechanics, with mechanics I mean the actions that the player takes to actually progress the game towards its completion. With a card game, typically it's just drawing the card and playing the card. So keeping the concepts of drawing and playing the card simple. And when it comes to systems, I'm talking about all of the things that support this mechanics to basically give the gameplay more variety, as well as more ways for the players to interact with the game. Perhaps, for example, spell cards in Magic or Yu-Gi-Oh! Those are a system where you are basically given a type of card that can only be played under certain conditions. The interaction interact with other cards in a different way. For example, many spell cards in both games actually don't have board permanence, unlike a monster or creature. Right, that's a system. A card that gives you the ability to draw more cards or search your deck, those are cards that play with the systems of the game that typically are not interacted or used in that specific way when you play the game through just the base mechanics of just playing and drawing the card based off the rules of how you would normally go through a turn. Rules-wise with this game, it feels like there's just so many different things that you need to remember and pick up, especially at the start of the game, that it makes it very hard for people to want to actually begin even trying out and getting into the game in the first place, because you look at the rule sheet that they have and all the different things that you need to do. Right, imagine being told at the start of the game when you pick up the game that, oh, here's your tiny ass little rule book. You're gonna have to flip through and learn every single thing that's written in here. Yeah, but just pay no mind to the fact that there are just so many pages in this thing. You're gonna need to learn all of this in its tiny ass font that frankly is much smaller than even a grain of rice probably is. You expect someone to actually stare and read through and navigate all of this to figure out how to play the game. It can be very off-putting, especially for people who have never played a card game before. And on top of that, the terminology used to explain things like turns and phases are all different. So, like, I'm gonna assume that there are many females out there who also enjoy playing card games, like Yu-Gi-Oh, for example. Especially when you look at the amount of BL that comes out for Yu-Gi-Oh, I'm pretty sure that a lot of them probably do follow the IP so that they can have their characters M-walk each other instead. With this game, you kind of have your phases being separated into the morning, afternoon, and night thing. And the afternoon phase has so many things going on between it, in spite of the fact that arguably each of those things have to be done in a specific order in order for the turn to progress, and therefore you can split each one into its own individual phase, named in a way that is easier for people to understand and remember. Like when you tell me morning, right? That's like the worst part of the day. That's the part where I wake up, question my life, and wonder if I want to even get out of bed. I don't think of drawing cards immediately. The same can be said for the afternoon phase, where you have so many different things going on. Why couldn't you just name the phase into multiple sub-phases instead, where you do each of the individual things, and you name it after the thing that the player needs to do, so that's easier for people who are starting out the game to remember. Right, you actually have to play a support character first, then play an event card, then level up your character. Why not just call it the support phase, the event phase, and then the level up phase? For a new player who has no idea what at all is going on, they can easily look at the card, see the words at the bottom, and be like, okay, so I have to play this first, then this after. Also, the fact that each of the sub-phases has its own restrictions on the number of cards that you can play means there's also more things to remember. Like, most games do have that to some extent, right? Magic has a restriction on you can only play one land a turn. Yu-Gi-Oh has the same thing with normal summon, where you can only normal summon once a turn unless a card says otherwise. But aside from that, you typically don't have that much in terms of restrictions on the type of cards that you can play unless a specific card effect says otherwise. With this game, the event, support, as well as the level up phase each have a separate limit on the number of times you can do each. And then on top of that, you have the hand cleanup phase at the very end of the night phase, which also like night, how am I supposed to know what I can do during the night phase? It's very confusing in its own way. But you have to basically use that phase to then figure out how many cards you want to discard to increase your LP up to a cap of 2 as well. There's a lot of caps on things that you can do that are not easily intuitive to begin with, because these are all things set within the rules that the player has to memorize, and that makes it feel like it's a lot harder for people to want to pick up the game, simply due to the fact that on the very first time you're going to play the game with them, you're going to basically have to tell them that, like, yeah, you're going to have to memorize all of these things because it's not written on any of the cards, and you're going to have to play most likely with the tutorial board for a long period of time, because of the fact that the game, without the tutorial board to tell you how much you have to remember each of the different card limits, it's going to be very difficult to remember that. And I feel like in a way that is really just going to intimidate a lot of new people, especially for a game which is not targeted so much at hardcore card game players, but also at a casual audience, kind of the way that Reverse and Y Shorts do. And so as a result, you're going to have an audience of people who may have never even touched a card game in their life. Also, they use very different words for turn. Like in most Japanese games, like even in Yu-Gi-Oh, they just use the word turn, except say it like tan, like in a more Japanese way instead. But with this game, they use teban instead, which I don't think I've ever seen that word used in any card game. Typically, card games at this point have all, ever since even the inception of Yu-Gi-Oh, used the word turn. So them going for a different word as well feels like it's just complicating things even more. If anything, it actually uses kanji as well, which you might think that like, oh yeah, but the Japanese people speak the language, they should be fine with kanji. But no, okay, no, nobody is ever really fine with kanji. Kanji is the thing that business people use to sound fancy so that they can laugh at you for being a dum-dum, alright? It's not something that people actively like using as much, and typically there's always the emphasis on like you want to mix kanji with hiragana as well as katakana to make it easier for people to actually read the text, because if you just give them a full string of kanji the way like the Chinese language works, many Japanese people find it difficult to read as well. So reducing the amount of kanji actually helps in a way to ensure that people can easier understand and remember the words that are being used as well. That said, credit where credit is due. This game actually does a pretty good job of trying to recreate the card flavor with its effects, in the sense that like, for example, you have this card from the BL series over here where you have the guy with a cold stare. That's what the game is calling the name of the card. It's giving a cold stare or a cold gaze towards someone, and the card actually reduces the opponent player's love points instead, you know, kind of fitting. He stares at them and it makes them feel like there isn't much love and connection there, and it just like fucks them up a little. Sounds like some weird like NTR, like you're trying to steal his man sort of shit going on there, but you know, that's not exactly the point of the game. But either way, it does fit the flavor of the card text and what the character is like in the game very well, since when you first meet the guy, he's like kind of cold even within the plot itself, and so you feel like he just like distances himself. This card here, which the art may be a little hard to see since it's a little dark, called Koko no Charisma, and basically it's the guy being super aloof, and typically it's the kind of like sense of pride and superiority that causes a person to also be distant from others in a sense as well. And with this card, that aloofness, that sense of like distancing from others is kind of represented as well in the way the card works, in the sense that the way his effect triggers, it basically causes you to remove one of your teammates on the field, and then you remove the opponent's like support side character as well. So you're truly like causing some level of isolation or like distancing that actually works towards his advantage in a sense, because you're basically using a targeted way to force the opponent to remove their like supports as well. So like you're actually like kind of trying to like imply a little bit that he doesn't really need the support of others, which in this game it actually does matter to some extent, because there are a lot of effects that basically require you to remove your own characters from the field to do things like sabotage the opponent or to draw cards for yourself. Like you remove 3 of your allies and then you draw 3 cards, for example, so you can basically recycle them back into the deck and refresh them or something. But basically he allows you to then target them and basically get ahead by removing both your and your opponent's supports and friends from the field. So they do stuff like that very well, and I feel like it's something that is lost in some of Bushiroad's other card games that would come after this. So this is one thing that I think that they did very well. One thing I don't like with this that is kind of maintained with a lot of Bushiroad's other card games, however, is just the fact that the art itself is very generic. They basically use cutscenes from the game itself as well as the basic still art, which I get that, you know, it's someone else's IP. It's best to give people what they like about the IP, which is the original art and the original scenes, but I feel like they could have mixed in some original art as well. Many of the other non-Bushiroad games like Lise, for example, tend to do that to some extent. So where even though it's a game based off the IP of others, they try their best to add in some level of unique art that is designed for the release of this new booster. But with this game and many of other Bushiroad games that we will see going forward, that seems to be very lacking. So I still feel like that is something that could have been improved with this game as well. But overall, we do see a lot of the trends that would carry forward into many of Bushiroad's future titles coming out in this game as well, in terms of the high reliance on rules to progress the game state. This is something that will actually arguably get even stricter from here on out, where they try to basically restrict or control every single movement that the player can take within the game to make it as easy as possible to know what to do. But in a way, it kind of restricts how people can really express themselves or their deck building within the game as well. The fact that this game completely relies on the IPs of other companies as well, like this one uses Vitamin C, it uses some BL titles, it uses Hakoki, all of which come from other companies instead, is also a show of the trend that would only really be bucked by Vanguard and Butterfly, as most of Bushiroad's other and arguably Bushiroad's most popular titles right now still do move along using this formula as well. But yeah, overall with this game, like the theme aside of like the whole like love and romancing thing and the whole like genre of the titles aside, I feel like as a game, this would actually have been fairly interesting to play, and it's something that I could actually see myself enjoying if it were actually used like IPs that I personally enjoyed more. Because systems-wise, it actually has a lot more going for it, and the player has a lot more control than some of other of like Bushiroad's future titles would have, because you actually progress towards the victory through actively taking actions that would achieve the victory state. Work towards and achieve not through an RNG trigger off the top of the deck, but through your ability to reshuffle the appropriate cards back into the deck and draw what you need as a result. You can actually, because of the fact that the deck only has I think like 40 cards for the full game, and you can actually play like characters and permanent events to some extent on the field, you can kind of reduce the number of cards within your deck and therefore try to increase your odds of drawing into the other cards and stuff like that. There are things that you can do that actually make it feel like you have control over what actions you are taking, and because of the fact that you're achieving off the end victory condition is based off of your action, right? You have to basically play 2 end cards on the field and then use an effect that would allow you to move the love point from 95 to 100. It feels actually well designed in a way to give people a satisfactory play experience as compared to some of the future titles would have, I would say. But aside from physical card games, there were some games that I'm putting to the end of this video because I'm not sure how best to put them or where to put them, because while Bushiroad themselves advertised these games as trading card games in a way, these games didn't really feel like what we know as trading card games or just like collectible card games either. And these games are basically 5-Cross as well as King of Pro Wrestling. So to put it very simply, both of these games have physical cards, but you couldn't actually physically play the game. You actually got the card and you had to scan the card and then use the card in a online card game. With the King of Pro Wrestling, it was a browser game, and with 5-Cross, it was a mobile game. But basically, you couldn't actually physically play the game with the cards, and you couldn't really trade the cards to others either, because you could only really redeem the card once. And the thing with, like, let's say the King of Pro Wrestling, for example, the way the game plays, it's pretty much just Rage of Bahamut, or if you're not a very old, halfway to your grave boomer like I am, it's something closer to maybe Million Arthur or Memento Mori, where it's a game that you just put characters into a deck and then you send them out to battle and then they automatically resolve everything. Basically the same thing. In a weird way, you know, like when I saw this game, it kind of reminded me of like when I saw like people on YouTube talking about how like there are those like weird NFT games where you buy a physical card and then put it into an actual like online incremental game. It would seem that even before Web3 even existed, Bushiroad was already doing all of this, so I don't know, man. Truly, they were running like bizarre things that were way ahead of their time, I guess. Needless to say, it didn't really catch on. This one just kind of died within a few years. And then you also had 5-Cross, which I actually did play 5-Cross for like maybe a few months before giving up on it. So unfortunately, it's not physically possible for me to play the game for you guys because one, it's a digital card game. I can't dive into my computer and play the game from within it, and two, the game has already ended servers, so it's not really possible for me to get a hold of like just the cards and play the game physically, because the thing with this game is that the physical cards, well, it didn't have the parameters of the characters on it. So you would think that you were just scanning the cards and you could play the game online, therefore you could play it physically as well, right? Since the cards basically had the parameters on them. But no, you actually couldn't, because you see, the thing with this game is that one of the big things that Bushiroad actually touted at the release or at one of the announcement events for the game, as if it was a good thing, was the fact that you could play this game even if you didn't know the rules of the game, which at that point I question what you're even playing in the first place. You know, like you can't really be playing the thing if you don't know how to play the thing, like quite literally. But okay, sure, we'll put that aside for now. And the other thing is that the game is, as a result, auto. You don't actually do anything other than put the deck together. In fact, it was kind of bizarre looking back at like all of the announcements for the era and seeing them tout the fact that the game was something that you could just enter, register for a tournament, set and forget, come back later and look at the tournament results. Like, yeah, that's the card game I want to play. the game where I don't have to play the card game at all and still turn up at tournaments. Overall, it sounds very bizarre. It feels like when you create a game, right, any form of game whatsoever, you kind of want to give the players some level of agency in what they do. Needless to say, this depends on the type of game, because with some games, people may not want to have as much agency while playing it. For example, with an incremental game, right, something like Cookie Clicker, you just need to give them the decision to be able to purchase the thing that makes their clicking more efficient and give them the ability to click the thing. But people typically play it not as a game where they want to be involved in a lot of key decision making within it, but something where they just want to progress the thing. And maybe, like, especially with the case of Cookie Clicker, you have all sorts of different things that can trigger in the sense of like splitting paths and stories that the game tries to portray through the clicking itself, kind of like a visual novel in a way. But the issue I have with this game specifically is that it actually feels like the other end of the extreme for what Bushiroad has done, where they have basically removed all forms of player agency from the game, because now you don't really need to even play the game at all. You're just setting the deck prior to the gameplay itself, so you get to select out of the 9 slots on the board where you want your characters to be placed, and then basically each character has a range stat, which basically would decide whether or not they can attack across everyone in front of them to hit the enemy. So the character put in the furthest back row can only hit an enemy in the first row if they have a range of 3, for example, and stuff like that. If you place them in a certain way, they might get link bonuses and all of that. And you do get to decide what's in your deck that is drawn automatically and played automatically. But the thing is that you don't actually get to play the game itself, and you don't even really need to like spectate the games, which, as you can imagine, basically this kind of just makes this game like a auto, right, social game or gacha game, some people prefer to call them, because really that's all you're doing. You're buying packs, which a pack, you know, with the random rates that they have, kind of are basically just a gacha. Your gameplay is being auto-resolved for you, kind of like in the PvP for like Princess Connect or something. So you basically have something that has even less gameplay interaction than most of these games, because at least in most of these games, you kind of still need to actually clear stages. You have high difficulty dungeons that you might need to manually play through as well. There's actual player agency you can put into the way that you control the characters in the actual gameplay itself or in the board that would actually massively impact the outcome of your rankings. Like, you know, with things like Grand Blue, you need to actually ensure that you use the correct spells or the correct skills, attack the enemy at certain points, and all of that will basically ensure that you can maximize damage for your guild or clan battles and whatnot. So in a way, this game kind of just ended up becoming, in my opinion at least, a worse version of those, because realistically, you're at this point offering the exact same experience, but with less gameplay, because you don't really have any form of like story progression, any form of stage progression where like you get map changes or anything of the sort. The game is just extremely basic. The other big issue of this game is the fact that it is a lot more cost inhibitive than most of those games, because most gacha games, they typically tend to be free to play in the first place. You can pick up the game, and if you so choose to, you can play the game for free. But with this, you have to purchase packs to get the cards, and then you use the cards to form the deck, and only then would you actually have a strong deck that you can then actually use to play against others or in tournaments and actually win. Because for me, I remember for part of when that came out, I was actually overseas during that first few months as well, and because of that, I wasn't actually able to purchase cards from all the way in Europe. So I just kind of just played it online, and it just felt like I was just playing any other like gacha game at the time. Right, it's not like in your typical mobile social game where progression is through grinding, and grinding can be simplified through spending. And the same applies to most of the popular online card games like Hearthstone and Shadowverse. Most of them do have a way for you to grind within the game to progress your deck building within the game itself, where you're able to grind for in-game currency, and you can just use it to get the packs, and you can then grind the cards you don't want into dust, and then use that to redeem the cards that you actually want. So either way, even if you couldn't get the cards you wanted from the packs, you had a way to ensure that you were able to progress your deck building over time through repeat play. This is something that 5Cross just simply did not have at all, and I feel like that worked to the game's detriment in terms of actually trying to retain players. But yeah, the game had a lot of issues with it, and by the time I'm done talking about all of this, I feel like an entire round of the game would have already been over, because an entire single round of this game would only take maybe like 4 to 5 minutes to complete. That's how short a single round is, and it kind of makes sense, because if you want it to be a mobile experience that people can just watch on their phone, 5 minutes is already very long for something with minimal interaction. So I get the shortness, but once again, this didn't really feel like a TCG nor a CCG, because you kind of didn't really have a good way to trade cards. You could only trade a card that you had not registered into the game, and it wasn't a CCG in the sense of like a Hearthstone or Shadowverse, where for cards that you didn't want and didn't have a use for, you could just grind into dust within the game and get the things that you need. So overall, this one was also very bizarre. This game actually came out in 2013 and ended service in 2016, barely 3 years before it actually just was completely gone. So that wasn't really much to begin with, although it's interesting to see like there are still videos of people unboxing cards from this back like maybe 11 years ago when the game was initially released, and there are actually some forms of gameplay preserved online that you can actually look at to get a grasp of what the game was like. But that said, overall, these are the games that I would consider to be the Stone Age of Bushiroad. Obviously, with games like Five Cross, it came out a lot later, but it was in a way where they were trying to experiment with a completely different medium, and one that arguably most card games at the time had not gone on yet, so I would include it with the rest of these titles as one of their more experimental games. With the online card games, I feel like they actually went in a very strange direction. I kind of see why they chose to do it in a way, perhaps in the sense that all of these social games, these games with the gacha monetizations, were doing really well, and they probably wanted to get into it while relying on their own strengths, which is in the card game business. And there are some similarities in the way these two genres of games kind of monetize, and so maybe they thought that they could get into that space digitally from here. And when it came to the physical card games as well, they made games that were very, very different systems wise. One a lot more fun than the other, but it did seem like they were actually getting, with each of these titles progressively, a better idea of how to develop a card game, as well as the rules needed to ensure that a game can reach a logical conclusion and that will allow players to interact in a way that will be fun. But that's it. When it comes to the future videos in this series where we talk about all of the other titles that they have released, I mean, we're going to be a little more harsh, since at that point it feels like they should have known better, especially since they had both the time to actually develop multiple card games, some of which became a success, and they also managed to get the help of many actual veterans within the industry to develop some of their titles. So it feels like they should have known better, and they should have produced a better product. Now, when it comes to the games that are still alive, like White Schwartz as well as Vanguard, we'll be talking about those a lot later into the series, since with the amount of time those games have been alive and all that they have gone through, there's a lot more to unpack. But for the next part of the video, we're going to be talking about what I call the Bronze Dark Age, the Dark Bronze Age of Bushiroad, where it has reached the point where they actually have experience developing multiple titles, and they do seem to have found some level of direction of where they want to take the card games that the company produces going forward. However, in spite of that, the directions that they did take the card games in the subsequent era all tended to be not as, no, I guess in a way they kind of were as, just not as good as what one would expect for a company that had actually started to improve. Some of which I've actually played before as well, and some of which I was actually at the initial release event for, and that I actually got to see release and then EOS within just less than the span of a year. So yeah, titles that really didn't do very well at the time. Obviously, there are some that are going to be maybe unique and interesting as well, but I guess you guys will have to see the next video. Until then, this is all that you'll get from me for today. I hope this was interesting. I don't know if it is. Hopefully it is, because like with this, we're doing something a little different from what I usually do, and I'm trying to see if I can make this into its own interesting series as well. So do let me know how you guys feel about this video in the comments down below, and I'll see if there's anything I can do to actually improve this. Thank you to the very cool people who helped to back the channel. It's thanks to you guys that I'm able to continue doing all of this, so very epic of all of you to actually help with like supporting the channel itself. Now that I've actually shifted off of using Adobe Premiere as well, there's more of the money that I can actually put towards the stuff required for the videos and everything else, instead of actually tossing it into the shitty monthly subscription and all. So hopefully we can actually try to improve the quality of the videos even more. Maybe I can actually get better lighting in the room so I don't look like there's a shadow and this weird lighting that's constantly shining on my face as well. Hopefully we can do all of that. But that said, until next time, take care and ta-da! Bye-bye.